This video is going to be looking at some conspiracies in opposition to Tiberius, and then his resulting kind of actions to it, which are the treason trials. So there's quite a variety of different sources to do with this. We've got some Velleius, some Tacitus, Suetonius, some younger Seneca. So you need to find the opposition and conspiracy section and the treason trials. They are next to each other in the source book. So we're going to start a section with Velleius, keeping in mind that Velleius is very much a fan of the Caesars, particularly Augustus and Tiberius. So what he's going to say is going to be putting quite a positive spin on some of the behaviours that's going on at this time. So he starts with this kind of, I don't know how to quite phrase it, but sort of kissing up to the emperors is here, a natural imperatant for a humble mortal like myself to dare utter this complaint to heaven. So anyway, just be aware this is kind of summarises what Velleius is like when talking about these issues. And he lists a couple of conspiracies that we should be aware of. So we have the abominable conspiracy of Drusus Libo against him, and then we also have some behaviour from Silius and Piso. We've already mentioned Piso. And we also have some evidence here about Tiberius's sort of behaviour towards the Senate, where it says whose high status he either established or enhanced. So he's kind of following Augustus's behaviour in promoting key members of the Senate as well. And then he sort of lists and it's all kind of very flowery language. But we also have Marcus Vicinius. These last three have brought him heart-rending distress. It was fire devouring his very heart. It's all very kind of over the top, and some sort of issues why he's quite upset about things that have happened because his mother has died and all the rest of it. Well, not died, yes, so has died. So it doesn't give us a huge amount of detail, but it gives us some nice evidence to show that there are some conspiracies against Tiberius. So then we go on to a section of Tacitus. So again, we do have another mention of Tacrophanius here, and talking about that he has been sort of using guerrilla warfare and has as a result kind of like befooled the Roman soldiers. So there's just, I warned you when we did the mutiny section that this guy pops up all over the place. So he's in here again, and he can pick out more things about what was going on in the order in terms of the conspiracy, but we've already read through the sources on the conspiracy, so don't worry about it too much. And then we have the idea that it's got this guy called Manius Lepidus. At least he's not called Marcus for a change. Manius Lepidus, who gives a speech against Tiberius. The speech to me doesn't particularly make a lot of sense. I think basically Tiberius was trying to punish someone, and then this is kind of like criticism of that punishment. Yeah, I've read it a few times. It doesn't particularly make sense to me. So if contraries would regard one point only, the enormity and utterance by which Clutorius Priscus, I think, had defiled his own soul in the ears of men, neither the cell nor the noose, not even the torments reserved for slaves, are adequate to his punishment. But if while vice and crime are limitless, the penalties and remedies of both are tempered by the sovereign's moderation. Right, we'll highlight that because that's quite handy. So we've got the idea that maybe Tiberius isn't reacting to conspiracies against him properly. I forgot to do moderation. There we go. There we are. So he's probably sort of criticising the emperor, which is obviously could be quite dangerous behaviour to do. There's room for a proposal which neither leaves the defendant's guilt unpunished nor causes to rue our softness or our hardness of heart. So I think he's basically criticising whatever Tiberius is doing is not the right thing, and he's unhappy about it, essentially. So that's fine. What we do have then is this beginning of a hint of what's coming next in the section of Tacitus. So it says, formerly aristocratic families of wealth or a standing distinction were apt to be led by their downfall by a passion for magnificence. So the Senate's maybe becoming a little bit corrupt. It was still a legitimate court to be courted by the populace, so the plebs are still really important to the Senate in trying to establish their power, and also provincials, etc., etc. And then it sort of gives you a bit of a hint that something's not going to be very good next, after merciless executions. So there are some conspiracies against Tiberius. They don't really come to very much, and probably not as dangerous as the ones under Augustus. And this sort of what comes next is partly as a result of his conspiracies, but also partly of the behaviour of Sejanus, and the fact that he was then removed, and then Tiberius comes back, obviously, into Rome permanently. well, pretty permanently. And then it leads to something called the Treason trials. Now, before I go through the sources on the Treason trials, I should warn you, there are some pretty unpleasant torture scenes coming up. They're quite ingenious, but they're pretty unpleasant. There is also some mention of sexual assault in the sources. So if you do have an issue reading with these, do be aware that this part of the source will talk about this. I will try and kind of flag it up when it comes, so you can skip over a little bit of the video if you so wish. So yeah, there's my sort of trigger warnings for you. So we then have these treason trials, and Suetonius is really good on this section. Tiberius broke out every sort of cruelty and never lacked victims. So these treason trials sort of went across all of society, but essentially he was targeting the Senate and the equestrians. So those sort of initially he was supporting Sejanus, and then it sort of carried on beyond that. So Sejanus out of the way, his savageries increased. So it proves Sejanus was not inciting him, but that it just gave him some opportunities. So Tiberius sort of was killing some people under some treason trials under Sejanus, and then they go further, quite horrifically further. And then it's sort of, a detailed list of Tiberius's barbarities will take a long time to compile. Yeah, probably. It says, no, not a day, however, wholly pass without an execution. So I'll highlight that. So they're sort of having every day. Many of his victims were accused and punished with their children. Some actually by their children. Relatives are forbidden to go into mourning. I mean, these were awful, awful situation going on in Rome. Special rewards were voted to the informers. The informers were always believed. Every crime became a capital one. You're getting a very nice kind of broad understanding of what is going on here. And it kind of gives you a few examples of people who sort of said something slightly wrong in a speech and got targeted as well. So then even if you weren't killed, those who escaped to the prison sentence, so you weren't allowed to read any books, you weren't allowed to talk to anybody. So they're like being tortured by sort of solitude, by solitude. So that's absolutely horrific. And some, obviously, who were accused were really worried about being found guilty, so ended up actually sort of trying to kill themselves. Yeah, if they were found in time, Tiberius's men bandaged their wounds and carried them half dead to prison, whether they then was been executed later. Others obeyed their summons and drank poison in full of the Senate. So notice here the Senate is not doing anything about this. So we have evidence here that the Senate is completely lacking in any power. Or any ability to do anything, depending how you look at it. And Tiberius is allowed to do whatever he wants to do in this particular situation. And the bodies of all executed persons were flung to the stairs in mourning and dragged to the Tiber with hooks. So it is absolutely horrific. So this bit here talks about some sexual assault, which I've not highlighted. So if you want to skip over it like I'm going to, that's absolutely fine. If you want to read it, that is also fine. So Tiberius used to punish with life those who wished to die. So for those who were willing to kill themselves, he would make sure that they didn't kill themselves. It's absolutely horrific. And it just carries on. This whole source is just kind of talking about it. So Tiberius grew enraged and redoubled his cruelties until nobody was saved from torture and death. And it's to do with this particular Drusus affair. He sort of talks about how it's a place at the cliff top where Tiberius used to watch his victims being thrown into the sea after prolonged and exquisite tortures, and then they'd be beaten up by people on some boats to make sure they were absolutely dead. There's sort of a particular example of torture here, which I haven't highlighted, but I'm going to read it to you because it's quite amusing. Well, it's not funny, but it's amusing. An ingenious torture Tiberius devising was to trick men into drinking huge draughts of wine, and then suddenly to knot a cord tightly around their genitals, which not only cut into the flesh but prevented them from urinating. Which is horrible. I mean, it's funny, but it's horrible. So that's like a torture that he used to use. I shouldn't laugh, but it's a horrible image. Can you imagine it being... Anyway. So he was just killing kind of everybody, and it was absolutely, absolutely horrific. And then we kind of have Vellius's version of the situation. So remember, Vellius is going to be very positive about whatever happened because it's Vellius. So there's a trial of Drusus Libo, how impressive was the serious attention which Tiberius gave the case, how impressive the speed with which he disposed of that ungrateful revolutionary. So, yeah, this guy was tortured and then, executed. So, but in this case, Tiberius did the right thing. He was fantastic. And then he sort of talks about how he'd used Germanicus really well, welcomed him to conquer Germany. Hang on, I'll highlight Germanicus so it makes more sense. There we go. Loaned that man with the highest honours and gave him a triumph. So again, we've got evidence here for the use of family members, which is helpful for other questions. We also have Tiberius being really nice to people, how often and generously he gave largesse to the people. Great. He heaps honours on Germanicus again. He deals with another revolt here really impressively. So you've got sort of Svelius pushing loads of different events together, saying, isn't he fantastic how he deals with all these different things and treats Germanicus really well, and he's really generous and he's lovely. So he's basically just ignoring the treason trials because in his mind they just didn't exist. Getting back to the treason trials, we have a little bit of younger Seneca. So under Tiberius Caesar, treason charges became so commonplace they amounted to a form of national madness. Fantastic way of phrasing it. Cost the lives of more Roman citizens than any civil war. Any excuse for brutality was welcome. So it was absolutely terrifying what was going on in Rome. As I said, remember, it's not targeting the plebs in particular, it is focusing on the Senate and the equestrian order. So the plebs were sort of left alone, but they wouldn't even know what was going on because it was obvious what was happening because people were being flung off cliffs. It's absolutely awful. And then it gives you like this really weird story about one of the sort of stupid moments that led to someone being executed. So there's a guy wearing a ring at a dinner party. It had a portrait of Tiberius Caesar on it. He was given a chamber pot, and there was an informer watching, and they sort of said that his portrait had been brought into contact with something disgusting, and therefore an indictment was put together, and this guy was executed for being kind of, I don't know how to phrase it, sort of going against the emperor by having his portrait of the emperor on a ring touching the chamber pot or whatever was in the chamber pot. So these charges were hugely trumped up, and it was terrifying of what was going on in Rome. So again, we have another one. So we've got Considius Proculus, swept off the Senate House in the same moment, condemned and executed. We have, I'm not very good at highlighting, am I? There we go. Exile sentence of Pompeia Macrina. So a woman wasn't executed, but she was sent away. And then again, we've got more examples of why people were being executed. So we have this guy called Sextus Marius, who was, to leave no doubt, it was his greatest of his wealth that had been redound to his ruin. So his copper mines, gold mines, though forfeit to the state, were reserved for Tiberius alone. So again, it's not just that these people have done something wrong, they're being picked and executed for a reason. This case could be about money. He gave orders for all persons in custody on the charge of complicity with Sejanus to be executed. Well, yeah, that's kind of makes slightly more sense. So these treason trials were awful. We have evidence here that the Senate's not doing anything about them. They're just allowed to carry on with no sort of opposition to what Tiberius is doing, probably because they're slightly frightened about what would happen if they did show any opposition, and Tiberius is able to do whatever he wants to whoever he wants in this way. So is this evidence that Tiberius wants to be in power, or is this just the actions of a very paranoid old man? Maybe a bit of both. Either way, it's a particularly terrifying time for those in Rome.